before I get started, I just want to say a big thank you to my clients, the Firework. So Firework is a company that, Firework is an e-commerce startup that helps other brands and companies create and host interactive video shoppable content. And you may want to contact them through this QR code. So they have been doing a lot of stuff with Elixir for many years now. And they have a quite large code base, interesting use cases. Unfortunately, I will not have the time to discuss that today, but in the slot after the next one, in the other room, I believe it's Canaveral, Nick and Lukasz are going to talk about building a digital human with membranes, so you may want to check that one out. Right, and so also, while you're taking the photo of this or scanning, quick info that I have some stuff to give away. So I have a couple of Elixir in Action books, and courtesy of the Oban team, I also have a few t-shirts with the table from the book on the back side. So find me after the talk if you want to get some of that. And with that out of the way, let's fold the umbrella, right? So I'm going to start with the problem here first, right? So the thing is that, like, you're building something, and I'm going to call this thing a solution. And for reasons I'm going to get into a little bit later, you have decided to split this solution into smaller, into multiple pieces, into mixed projects or apps, right? I'm going to use these terms interchangeably throughout this talk, with the term app specifically meaning an OTP app. And so you have to somehow manage these multiple projects, and there are different ways how you can do this. We're going to focus on the one on the right, which is called Umbrella, which is a specific mixed project. It's basically a container of other mixed projects, right? So an Umbrella project does not produce an OTP app. It doesn't have its own source code, the lib, the test folder, and so on, but it just has these sub-projects, you know, simple app projects, right? And the unique benefit of Umbrella compared to the other approaches would be that you can work on your solution as a single thing, right? So you have, you can use, like, you can invoke a single mix command to compile everything, to run everything, to test everything. You use a single instance of IDE with the full support of Elixir language server, so you have like code completion, navigation, on-the-fly completion, and so on and so forth. Now, multi-apps in general and umbrellas in particular have some downsides. You know, nothing comes for free, and I want to briefly go over that, admitting up front that these are, like, in many cases, minor nitpicks, you know, but bear with me here, and hopefully you're going to be able to see where I'm heading with this, right? So the first thing is that a mixed project has some of the boilerplate associated with it. You know, it's low footprint, but still you need to have mixed CXS, you need to declare your dependencies, maybe define some aliases, some other options, and then you need pretty much, in many cases, you know, you're going to need an OTP app module, some other files like formatter, config, and whatnot, and you're going to need this for every app that you have, for every project that you have in your umbrella. And in some cases, this is plain noise and duplication. Not all cases, but there are cases where this is just plain duplication, right? And hopefully you're going to see this by the end of the talk. Then more importantly, when it comes to multi-apps, regardless of the approach, and specifically in umbrellas, you know, Mix does sequential processing, right? So like when you do mix compiler test, you know, let's focus on compilation. It's going to compile app 1, then app 2, and so on and so forth. And this is like right there in your face. You see it in the terminal. But what I found that many people fail to understand is that you lose potential for concurrent processing, right? So you lose potential for concurrent compilation. And I have seen the cases where replacing an umbrella with a single app significantly improved compilation times, you know, by like a few seconds per normal compilation, not full recompile, but just like you change a couple of files and you do mix compile, which you do pretty much all the time, like when you're doing mix test and whatnot, you know, it's going to shave off a few seconds in some cases, right? So this is a significant issue. Not always, but it can be. And then the final thing is, and I'm going to admit this is somewhat subjective, you know, I find the umbrella structure to be somewhat weird. Like, you know, each app is defined in its own project, but then you have the central configuration, you have the root mix CXS, and I'm never really sure, like when I'm adding an alias, for example, like should it go into the root one, or should it go into the app mix CXS, right? And then there are like some mixed tasks which are working kind of weird, you know, which is admittedly a problem of tooling, but I found, like, as author of some mixed tasks, that like umbrellas are somewhat of a special case, like an Internet Explorer of mixed projects, if you will. Like you write something for that works with mixed projects, and then you have to do a special case for umbrellas, right? For some mixed tasks, you might need to go directly into the app folder to execute them. Most of the others are executed on the root folder. And then my pet peeve is the output of various mix commands, such as mix test, when the path is relative, the path of the file, which is in output, is relative to the app folder, not to the root, you know. And so I run mix test, and some tests are failing, and my typical flow is, you know, to pick one test, I'm going to copy the path colon line number and feed it back to mix test, and this is not going to work because the path is not relative to the root folder, right? And this hits me on a daily basis multiple times. You know, I find it annoying. Now, in general, I would admit that these problems are mostly significant if you have a handful of apps which are hefty, you know, which have a lot of code, right? And I would say, you know, that multi-apps work well for a very coarse-grained split, you know. But the more finer-grained you get, then the more these problems are going to bite you, right? And this is an important premise behind this talk. Now, given that we do have some price to pay, it's always worth thinking about, like, why do we even use this thing in the first place, right? And so these are the reasons, the way I see them. Maybe something is missing, and feel free to add to this list. But broadly speaking, like, you may want to go for multi-projects because you want to have separate development cycles. You know, like, you split your solution across multiple teams, and then each team has their own autonomy in choosing, like, the versions of Erlang, of Elixir, of dependencies, their own deployment cadence, right? And so this is really where you need multiple projects, and so that's perfectly fine. Umbrellas are not going to cut it, though, so either Poncho or more likely Polar Repo is going to be your good choice. Another case is when you want to, where you don't care about separate development cycles, but you do care about splitting things into services at runtime, you know, because you get some objective operational benefits. Like, you can be able to deploy one thing without restarting everything else, you know, which improves your uptime and your availability. Or you might have different scaling needs in different parts of your system, like, you know, one thing has to be scaled horizontally, another thing has to be a singleton, running a single instance in the cluster, right? And so this is easy to achieve with services, and multi-apps are a good approach, a good fit for that challenge. But here, I think many teams, many people are missing the thing that you can, like, actually make a simple approximation of umbrellas in a single project simply by, you know, conditionally starting things in your supervision tree depending on some externally set OS environment variable or something like that. And I'm not suggesting this is a good approach always, but it's a good simple start if you have just a handful of services, you know. And you can always go towards a more elaborate division down the line if you need it, right? So at least consider this option because it may simplify your life and give you what you need. But the third thing, and this is what we're going to focus on today, is in the case when you don't care about, like, you have just one team, you know, and you have just one thing, one service, a monolith, and still you introduce umbrellas to modularize your code, right? To split this larger code base into smaller pieces, which are, like, supposedly loosely coupled, and then you can work on individual parts in isolation, right, which simplifies your life. And this is the diagram taken from the slide from the presentation by Wojtek Macht. It's from 2016 ElixirConf US. It's a really good presentation, I would say very influential. And basically what Wojtek did is, like, he has taken an implementation of a hypothetical banking system and defined different areas of responsibilities, assigned each responsibility to a separate app, and then put it all under a single umbrella, right? And this approach is, I wouldn't say it's revolutionary. So, like, in the past life, when I was a .NET developer, I've seen this being done in .NET too. I'm pretty sure that other languages and communities have similar approaches. And really, you know, the general idea, what's happening here is, are these arrows, right? These arrows are important, you know. So here, basically, these arrows represent dependencies, and they are encoded in mix EXS of each application, right? And as a result, you can actually verify these dependencies, and you can report problems when the dependencies are violated. Like, if you're invoking bank web from a bank, you're going to get a compilation warning. And if you try to add, because, you know, bank does not depend on bank web, right? And if you try to add this dependency, then you're going to get, I think, mix error or something. Mix is going to complain that you're introducing a cycle, so that's not going to work. And you are able to control these arrows, and this is what you want, right? Because you don't want to have everyone depending on everyone else, right? You don't want those arrows to fly around, because then you don't have modularity, you know? Everything is entangled. In order to understand anything, you have to understand everything, and, you know, the purpose is lost, right? And this is basically the gain of the umbrella app in this case, right? But the problem here is that we pay a lot of price for that. So, like, we have 7 arrows. This is 7 simple pieces of information. For that, you need a more elaborate folder structure. You need about a dozen of new files. You need about more than 100 lines of code, even in this toy implementation. And you're going to pay all the price that I mentioned, like sequential compilation and sequential test execution. And you can call me thrifty, but I think this is too expensive, for 7 simple pieces of information. On top of that, it works only on a coarse-grained level, right? So like if you focus on the bank, this is the business logic, and it's safe to assume it's going to grow in, it's going to be wide and it's going to be deep. There's going to be a lot of stuff happening there. And the question is, how can I control my dependencies in there? And the answer is like, you can either split it and go for a finer grain split, and then those problems are going to hurt you more. Or you can use like namespaces, right? The top level modules. So you can have bank.foo depending on bank.bar, but not the other way around. But you don't have a way of enforcing that through tooling. So you can only rely on your discipline. And this is going to fail fast, and this is going to fail epically, right? And these are your choices on the table. And all of this basically made me think that like we are missing some part in our tool chain, right? Because what we want to do here is check and automatically check our internal dependencies inside our solution, right? And Umbrella simply doesn't feel, like the way to go, right? And so out of that, I tried to make a prototype in early 2019, and I was able to prove to myself that it's possible to actually check these constraints without having multiple apps. And for the record, I researched a bit. I think in 2016 this was not possible. So back when Wojtek was doing the talk, I think umbrellas were, or Poncho, were the way to go. But out of this experimental library called Boundary has been born. And Boundary is basically a library that allows you to manage your internal in-project dependencies, cross-module dependencies, without requiring an app split. And as a selling point, I would say when it comes to modularization and modularization alone, Boundary gives you everything Umbrella gives you and more at a fraction of a price in a much simpler way. And hopefully I'm going to be able to demonstrate it through that demo because this slot is too short for my appetite, so I don't have the time for a live one. So I did like some steps in a project in a temp folder, and I'm going to show you some relevant parts of it, right? So I created the projects, PHX new is going to do just fine. It's going to create a few models for us, and we're going to boundarize it, right? And so to do this, you need to add boundary as a dependency, and then you need to set a boundary as a compiler, and it has to precede the Elixir compiler. I'm mentioning it because I had one bug report where this wasn't done, right? And so boundary basically relies on a feature which is called compilation tracing, which basically allows us to get notification from the Elixir compiler during compilation. Most notably, the compiler is going to invoke boundary code whenever it encounters a cross-module call. Boundary is going to store these calls, and at the end of the compilation, it's just going to compare them against some user-defined rules and report problems as compiler warnings. As a result of that, you basically don't have to run mix boundary. There is no mix boundary. You just run mix compile, mix test, mix release, and so on, and boundary does its job. Yeah, that's basically the general idea. So as soon as we add this, we're going to get 12 warnings. And here you see another nice benefit of emitting compiler warnings. You get nice integration with the language server and IDE. In this case, it's VS Code. So yeah, we have 12 warnings. These are 12 instances of the same problem. Basically, module is not included in boundary. Boundary, in the context of this library, means a group of module. No more, no less, And so you basically have to define some groups, and you have to assign modules to them. A module can belong to a single boundary, and you have to cover all of your modules with boundaries, right? And so to do that, you need to insert use boundary into a module. And so here I'm creating a demo boundary and a demo web boundary. So boundary always has to correspond to an existing module. And boundary by default encompasses all the sub-modules, right? So like if you have demo.foo and demo.bar.buzz, they are included in the demo boundary. You can extract them separately into their own separate boundaries if you want, right? But by default, we encompass the sub-modules. And so basically, with these 2 lines of code, we have grouped all of our modules, and those 12 warnings have disappeared. Now, a small but very important side note. Use boundary does not inject any code. It doesn't define any function. It doesn't reinterpret any Elixir expression. The only thing it does is it takes the options you pass to it. Currently, it's an empty list, but you're going to see some options. And it stores them as a module attribute. And that's it. And so the big point here is that there is zero magic. There is zero cost, both at compile time and at runtime. Not zero, but close to zero. The cost is very small. Compile time or runtime-wise, memory-wise, or performance-wise with boundary. That was an important goal for me. OK, so we have taken care of those 12 warnings. Now we got new 2 warnings, and we're going to start with the second one first. So basically, we get this forbidden reference warning. And reference means like invocation of a function from another module, or just a mention of the module name, you know. And so here we basically have a cross-boundary call, and this is by default not allowed, right? So you have to opt into it. It's pretty much like a lightweight app within an app, if you want to think about it, right? So demo web is calling demo, and that's not allowed, and you know you need to allow it by adding the dependency, and it's as simple as that. And this is just, you know, we're adding one piece of information, and that's, you know, that's much less noise compared to you know mix CXS and all the dependencies listed, you know. So yeah, we have taken care of that warning, and so we progress further, and we get another warning in the same place. You know, superficially it looks the same, but in the parentheses there is a different reason. And here basically we go beyond what we get with umbrellas and poncho, right? So here we get a problem that demo data case, which is invoked, is not a part of the public API of the boundary. So we basically have introduced public-private modules notion, right? And by default, the root module is public, and it cannot be made private. All the other modules are private, and you explicitly have to make them public, right? And so for this, the solution could be to add data case to the list of exports. Like this could maybe work, but I don't think it's a good solution, right? And it kind of screams in your face, you know, like, should I actually make this very internal module as a part of the public API of my boundary, right? And a better example here would be repo. You know, this is what I had in mind when I was designing this thing, you know, like repo should not be public, right? So you should not be calling repo directly from web, because then your presentation depends on your internal storage, right? And this becomes very intertwined, and again, you lose modularity, right? And so that wouldn't be a solution for me. And besides that, it's actually not going to work quite well, because data case exists only in test environment. So in dev and prod, if you're compiling, you're going to get warning. You're going to get a different warning that you're exporting something which does not exist. And so the solution I came up with, and this is an example of how boundary affected my code structure, I would say in a good way, is to introduce a test-only boundary. So I added it to the test support. This is an example of having a module just to have a boundary. In my experience, it happens like 2-3 times per project, so just a few times, not a lot. And anyway, you know, I introduced a test-only boundary. It's in test support, and I specify the option to ignore it. So boundary is not going to check the calls coming out of the test boundary. And to me, this is fine, because I find that occasionally, you know, it happens from time to time from test. I have to invoke some internal stuff, or maybe even cross boundaries, and I'm fine with that, you know. So either way, the point is that all stuff from test support is going to reside under demo test, rather than being in demo or demo web. And I personally find this actually quite nice, because my test support modules do not pollute my lib namespaces. And I find it nice, at least, you know, when I think about my module hierarchy. And it's also more consistent with respect to the folder structure. So yeah, that's going to take care of, you know, so you add a demo test and you change all the cases, move them under the demo test namespace, and you're good to go. And so we are left with a final warning. And you know, when I was first trying boundary on a Phoenix project, I was taken by surprise here, you know. So here we have call from demo to demo web, which, like, supposedly, according to the best practice and the folklore, should not be happening, you know. And out of the gates, Phoenix generator does that, right? And so, like, it's this one time, you know. It's not a big deal, of course, right? But it sets the precedent, and you're going to have more exceptions. You know, the one that I see all the time is invoking router helpers from the business logic, right? And so again, you're having this reverse dependency, right? And so we have to do something about it, right? And there are two solutions, really. So one could be to move app into the web boundary, and originally that felt wrong to me, and so I didn't do it. But now that I think about it, with a slightly different name from demo web, I think it's perfectly fine. But yeah, and it's a simple change. You just move it to that other boundary, and you should be fine, you know. But another thing that I've done historically, and it's a little bit more complicated, but not much, is introduce an app boundary. And so that's also the app module, right? And then I have to export the endpoint module, and this is fine. This seems fine to me, and then the problem is solved. So this is another approach, right? And anyway, you know, these are the main features, you know. So with this, we have taken care of all the problems in the Phoenix project, and now you actually have some automated check, which I would say already is more precise or more refined than what you get with umbrellas, with a fraction of a price. Now, I'm going to speak very briefly about two additional features, you know. And so one is the support for nesting boundaries, right? So you can do inception-style boundary within boundary within boundary, and so on and so forth, as, you know, deep or as shallow as you want to. And this was one thing that I wanted to explore, because, you know, I find that umbrellas are very coarse-grained, they work only on the top level, and I wanted to have the same mechanism that allows me to dive deeper, right? And further restrain my constraints, And so, like in a hypothetical blog engine, for example, here we're in the business logic, and so I could say that articles may depend on accounts and repo, and accounts may depend on repo, but not on articles, and then, of course, repo should be standalone, right? And I further tighten my constraints if I want to, right? And so, but this is like sub-boundary directly inside the block boundary itself. And then another thing is that boundary can check external dependencies, so calls to modules from other apps, right? By default, it doesn't do this. You have to opt in, and you can opt in per boundary, per application, and you can set some global defaults, right? And I'm going to show you one example which I personally like, and this is controlling the usage of mix, right? And so with mix, basically, you're not supposed to call it at runtime, right, within your functions, because if you're using OTP releases, which of course you should, mix is not available. On the other hand, at compile time, it's perfectly fine to call mix. Like outside of any function, you can call mix.env, and it can actually be quite useful, but you have to pay attention to that, right? And then finally, exceptionally, in mix tasks, you can call mix at runtime because tasks are executed where mix is available, like locally or on the build server, right? And this is quite trivial to actually check with boundary, right? So basically, I have to set some default options in mix CXS, and I'm telling boundary, check me the calls to mix, but only the runtime calls, right? And so just as a result of a single option in every boundary, boundary is going to report runtime calls to mix. It's going to ignore compile time calls, and you already have like 90% of the stuff taken care of. And now we have to solve the mix tasks, and to do that, we have to introduce a mix boundary. It's called demo mix, right? It cannot be called mix because mix module is in another app. And I set up a dependency to mix. So you can set up like implicit boundaries in other apps by just referencing their module names. Or if those apps define their own boundaries, then you can depend on them, right? So anyway, I'm telling like demo mix can depend on mix. And then there is one tiny complication, and this is that mix task has a special naming rule, so it has to be under the mix tasks namespace. And so you have to manually reclassify it into the demo mix boundary. And this manual classification is explicitly allowed only for mix tasks and protocol implementations, because these are the only two cases where I have discovered in practice where I don't have the control over the module name, but I want to be able to assign those things to boundary. Otherwise, I'm very opinionated that your boundary hierarchy should align with your module namespace hierarchy as much as possible. Okay. So either way, we will end up with something like this, with these kind of boundaries. I usually also have something like shared utils, with various helpers used by everything else. Yeah, I mentioned a little bit about the naming. So like some of you have maybe read or seen my interviews or heard my interviews, right? So I prefer to use demo interface rather than demo web. Interface meaning it's a piece of code which exposes my system to the outer world. And when I name it like that, then I think app makes perfect sense to be inside that namespace, because app is the interface to the OTP. Same thing for demo mix. Demo mix should be a sub-boundary then, because it has special dependency to the mix, to the mix namespace, right? But so that's roughly what I end up with, like for smaller projects. And this is basically the end of the tour of boundary. And very briefly, I'm going to talk about the use case at Firework. So when I started working with them, they had they had this monolith, big monolith, 300,000 lines of code, and they did the app split, I think, relatively recently before I joined them. They ended up with 30 apps, and one of those 30 apps was 230,000 lines of code, right? And this is what happens when you don't enforce modularity from your early days, right? It's going to happen to everyone, right? You're just going to end up so entangled, and you cannot like do this balanced split of, I don't know, 10 apps, 30K each. It's not going to happen, right? Everything is super connected, and you're going to have to make some small wins, right? You're going to have to find smaller pieces which you can extract out of this, huge thing, right? And for this particularly, Umbrella is to me like an overkill. You're going to pay a lot of price in this noise and in this sequential compilation and tests, and it just feels like too much for like having 29 relatively small apps, right? And this is where boundary works pretty well. And so we basically tried to see like, okay, is it going to work? Like, can we introduce boundary? Can we collapse this structure? And roughly speaking, this is how it looked like, So we basically, picked the one app, and we said like, we're going to add boundary to that app, and we're going to merge everything else into that app. And obviously, of course, it's the largest one, right? And so you add boundary to that app, you move the apps and one by one, and at the end you're going to end up with like an umbrella that has just one app, and then you just collapse the structure, move the app 2 folders above, and you're good to go. So that's the strategy. How do you add boundary to a large project, like 230,000 lines of code? You add a boundary dependency, you set up a boundary compiler, you're going to get some warnings about unclassified modules, you define your top-level boundaries, you set up the desired web depths, right, such as from, from web to business and so on, and then you're going to end up with like few thousand of additional warnings, and you're going to ignore those warnings. And that's fine. You're not going to be any worse than you were. You're already better than you were, right? But you're going to ignore those other problems. And those other problems there are like 2 problems. You're going to have unwanted dependencies, like your business depends on web. Router helpers is typical example. And you're just going to add them as dirty xrefs. And you're going to list those things explicitly. And later down the line, you can fix them one by one. So that's one thing. Another problem is that you're going to have a lot of references to private modules, right? And you can list those things explicitly in the exports, literally. And then you can try to work on reducing your API. Or alternatively, you can just say that you don't care about public-private stuff, and this is what we did in that large project because it was just too overwhelming, and so you can just say, like, I'm going to export everything from a business, I just don't have the capacity to deal with this now. But the big point is that you can introduce boundary very quickly, within a matter of a day or 2, without having any warnings, right? And already you're checking something. And so once you have that, how do you merge one app, like the source, into a target, right? So you basically move your code. There are like some exceptions. The application module is a good example. You cannot just move the app module. You're going to actually have to merge the code of 2 application modules. Same thing for mix EXS. You're going to have to adapt your configuration, the key, right? The keys of your configs, because the app is going away, so you have to change your keys, point them to the new app. You define the boundaries for the new top-level namespaces, and you're pretty much good to go, right? And so then you delete the old app. I would say it takes, once you get going, once you get in the groove, like, it's realistic to say 2 apps per day, 2 merges per day. Is like, it's a very finicky job. It's not really like intellectually rewarding, right? And so like I wouldn't go beyond 2 apps per day, but that sounds like realistic to me. And so, yeah, that's basically it. Once you've done that, you basically collapse an umbrella. So in summary, fold that umbrella, tuck it away, and enjoy your newfound simplicity and freedom in life. Thank you very much.